John 7:19. Nonne Moses dedit vobis legem, et nemo ex vobis facit legem. Has not Moses given to you all the law? And yet no one of you all does the law. This is a very brief verse, but as always, there are some things that we can learn from it in order to become better Latinists. First of all, we can note and remember that ne, which is an enclitic, that is, it is a word which is added to the end of words. It leans back on, literally, a stronger word or a more significant word. Ne, together with non, indicates that the answer expected to the question which follows is yes, or in Latin, sic, or ita. It's the equivalent, in fact, of English. Isn't it the case that, so on and so forth? The answer is yes, as implied from the context. So, is it not true, we might say, that Moses, has given to you all? Let's take a moment to parse this verb. You've seen it before. Do, dare, dedi, datum. This is a first conjugation verb, in fact, and for the perfect stem, that's what we have in the third principal part, we see some reduplication. This is what grammarians call it when the initial consonant sound of a verb's present stem is doubled or geminated in order to form another stem, in this case, the perfect stem. This occurs also in Greek and in some other Indo-European languages as well. So that tells us right away what we have here is third person singular, perfect, active, indicative. Now you will recall from when you originally learned the perfect, contextually, we need to determine the difference between two possible aspects involved here. We might simply translate the perfect with a simple past in English, or we might translate it into English with what is called the present perfect. Now, as I noted, these are terms that we use in English grammar rather than Latin grammar, but they're helpful here to help us understand the difference between the translation, did Moses not give to you the law? And the translation, has Moses not given to you the law? The second translation there emphasizes the present effect or result of a past action. And the Romans use the perfect tense for both kinds of past expression, but we know that that difference isn't simply a product of our modern English imagination. Sometimes students will ask me this in class. They'll say, well, if this is really only a problem that comes up when we're translating into English, how do we know that the Romans thought about the sense of the perfect tense in these two ways as well, the way we do? Since, of course, in Latin, there's just the one form, dedit, which teachers say, well, contextually that can give a simple past or a present perfect sense. How do we know that if we only ever feel the difference when we're actually translating into English? That's a good question. And the answer is we can tell from certain uses of the perfect in different contexts in real attested Latin. For instance, in the dramas of Terence, where we see both kinds of perfect being employed, we can tell from the context that sometimes the meaning of a perfect form has to be that of what we translate into English as the present perfect. And I'll give you a classic example, which to my mind demonstrates this beyond all doubt. Sometimes in Roman comedy, a character will say, perii. And in English, this will be translated as something like, I'm done for, I'm finished. That is to say, it's a colloquial expression that means it's all over for me, something really bad has happened. You're sort of comically saying, I don't really expect my life to continue because this event is so contrary to my wishes and expectations or something like that. But this is a perfect form of the verb pereo, to perish, and perii can't, in this context, mean I died or I perished one time with simple aspect at some point in the past. That simply doesn't make sense contextually in those passages. It has to rather be indicating the sense that we identify here as the present perfect. In other words, it must correspond to English, I have died. I'm relating the present results, which is that I'm despairing of life as a result of a past action, namely that I've sort of endured this event, which has just happened. If it doesn't mean that, the passage doesn't make any sense. So in other words, there are indications, and of course that's not the only one, but that is one of the smoking gun examples. There are indications that that sense of the present perfect aspect is not just sort of a figment of the imagination of people who speak other languages later on in time, reading these things back into Latin. They really are there. Now, that's not necessarily the most important thing in this particular verse, but this verse does give us an excuse to talk about it. And as you know, we'll seize any excuse to talk about something fun and interesting that we get. Now, vobis, in these two cases, looks exactly the same, but we should notice it's not the same case in both situations. In the first situation, we're getting a dative of the indirect object following the verb, as we said, do, dare. And in fact, when you first learned the dative of the indirect object, you probably learned it in association with the verb dare, to give, because that's what indirect objects often are, is they're objects which are given by one person to another person. So there we've got the dative form of the second person plural personal pronoun, vos, which is vobis. And we've got another vobis over here, but we can tell from the X, this has got to be an ablative vobis. No one from you all, that is to say, no one from your number, we might say in English, does the law. Nemo, we've talked about this before. Nemo originated in a kind of contraction of nullus homo, literally no person. Nemo, you can tell, is a lot easier to say than nullus homo. Nobody, Jesus is saying, and by the way, we should interpolate here a question in the beginning of a new sentence in order to punctuate and understand this correctly. And no one from you all, that is none of you, he says, does the law. And this is sort of an idiomatic expression in Latin. To do a law means to perform or fulfill it, or more idiomatically in English, we would say nobody obeys the law. No one observes the law.